Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Caudry, and I'm joined this morning in the studio by my co-host, Emil Kalinowski.
Good morning, Simon.
How are you, Emil?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Excellent. Well, today's show is going to explore the theme of globalization. What is it? How successful has it been? And is there a problem with it today? Are some of the questions that we're hoping to explore. The world moved in the 1980s into an increasingly free market direction. Economies opened up to trade, to competition, and there were wrenching changes that happened. Just think of the mining and manufacturing industries in many Western countries. A lot of jobs were gradually lost to overseas markets. Equally, though, economies grew at rates that were generating incredible improvements in standards of living. It is against that backdrop and the current unpopular revolt, or the current popular revolt against these somewhat unpopular systems and these symptoms of globalization, that the CFA Society Cayman Islands is hosting, in 1 week's time, its 6th annual investment forum, precisely on this globalization theme. One of the speakers at that event is joining us this morning to discuss this theme and to give us a precursor to some of the matters that he's going to discuss. With that, we're delighted to welcome back to Money Sense our friend Jeffrey Snyder, who is the head of global research at Alhambra Investments. Jeff, a very good morning.
Good morning to both of you, Simon and Emil.
How are you this morning?
I'm great, and I thank you very much for inviting me back. It was a pleasure being in the Caymans last year, and I very much look forward to it again next week.
Excellent. Well, one of the overriding objectives of this radio show is to help educate and inform our community about matters, and globalization is nothing if not a somewhat complicated subject. It seems as though people have been talking about globalization as though it has only been going on for the last 10 or 15 years. Yet the reality is that the world has been shrinking in the sense of borders have become more fluid and trade has become more common ever since the European countries sought to expand their empires both to the east and the west. So with that as a backdrop, perhaps you could help us understand, Jeff, as to the context of globalization, what it means today and how unique today's environment is.
Well, I think, Simon, first we have to stop and think, what exactly do we mean by globalization? And I think a lot of people oftentimes just take it as a shorthand, as something that we all just agree on. It's a thing that happens where, free trade, as you mentioned, the free flow of capital, much more depth of integration of economies and systems. But we never really spend a whole lot of time on the nuts and bolts, the details of that kind of thing. How did it happen? How does it all fit together? And therefore, maybe there's some inherent flaws in this version of it that we should be aware of in terms of how things are unfolding, especially in recent years and in the last decade. Globalization is not something that just started, as you pointed out, recently. In fact, there's been periods of globalization, increasing globalization throughout history. And really, this last period of globalization began in the 1960s and 1970s, ironically, with the breakdown of the monetary system of Bretton Woods. Again, we talk about something like the free flow of capital. What does that actually mean? And one of the reasons the Bretton Woods system fell apart or it stopped working was that its designers, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, they never envisioned, or they at least didn't, they envisioned it, but they never were able to incorporate a way for a growing world economy to be able to be supplied enough global money such that it would make globalization and economic growth a consistent, sustainable process. Under the gold exchange standard, we had what Robert Triffin called in 1960 the paradox, which was the United States had to supply dollars to the world, but in doing so, the more dollars that they supplied to allow for a global economic growth, the less of backing those dollars had under the gold exchange standard. And increasingly throughout the 1950s and 1960s, foreign countries and foreign entities started to take gold outside the United States, which brought us to this contradiction in the 1960s that inevitably ended the Bretton Woods system. Because there was no monetary mechanism to allow for expanding global money supply, not domestic money supply, but global money supply, because there was actually no way, or there was no method envisioned for having a global monetary system.
Jeff, so if I What I want to draw attention to for our audience here is that whenever most of us are thinking about globalization, we think of the beautiful things, the fraternity of nations, the interaction between other cultures. And that is globalization, and it's a moral imperative almost that we should all come together as a planet. But you're saying, what I heard you saying is that underneath it all, and I'm going to call this, there's something that's as crass as money. Money is the necessary ingredient, something that will create the beauty that we understand as globalization. Is that right? Is money the ingredient?
Well, Emil, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think the way you characterize it is probably the way most people would think about it. We think about the benefits of globalization, and they are tremendous, and they are visible in our daily lives. And I think a lot of people think that that's the direction the world should go in, closer integration, closer cooperation between nations and between people. But we never stop and think about how do these things actually happen. It's almost like, there's the world that we see, and then there's a world behind it that makes it work that we don't see. And I don't think people pay a lot of attention to the details, the nuts and bolts of how it works from A to B. What actually happens where we can get Peruvian grapes in South Florida in winter? I mean, what are the things? What are the necessary steps? What are the necessary, what are the necessary resources that need to be committed to make sure that these kinds of things not only work, but they work for everyone involved? And what there is behind all of this stuff is a monetary system. Again, we're talking about the free flow of capital, free trade, or at least the Ricardian equivalence idea of free trade, where we need a global monetary system to make sure all of these things can work. There has to be monetary resources in place to make sure that things can move around, because we're not just talking about the trade of the specific trade of goods back and forth, but there's a whole bunch more behind it, and some stuff that's just dizzyingly complex, and a lot of systems in place and a lot of flaws in those systems that nobody really appreciates for the generic happy idea of globalization.
Now, Jeff, you said during that answer something which I thought was quite interesting, that there's a world we see and a world we don't see. And I imagine Emil will want to drill down a little bit further into the monetary aspect of it. But just going back very, very much to first principles, when we talk of globalization, we need to I think we need to understand a little bit more clearly what we actually mean by the underlying activity. So humans, by their very nature, from the dawn of history, have needed to trade with one another. The more parties you can do business with, the more opportunities there are. So in its rawest form, globalization is nothing more than the ability of humans to interact with other humans, to trade services, and therefore increase their aggregate wealth. Am I on the right track there?
Absolutely correct. But we also need to recognize that there are inherent organic impediments to that type of behavior, especially when you're talking about going across national boundaries. There are very legitimate reasons why those things can't happen, or those things don't proceed very easily. And money is one of them. I mean, if you're a Brazilian rubber exporter and you want to sell your exports to Japan, from the very start, you have Brazilian real. The person on the other end has Japanese yen. Those two things don't go together very easily. And so there needs to be something in place to allow those things not just to happen, but to happen efficiently, smoothly, and in a way that can be repeatable and sustainable. That's the shadow world. That's the world behind globalization. It's the nuts and bolts of how these things take place. And I don't think most people stop and think. And why would they stop and think? I mean, because it's sort of a specialized thing. But why we have to stop and think about, sometimes it's incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to do those kinds of things, especially at the scale that we're attempting here. That's another part of globalization I don't think it's appreciated, is that you're right, Simon. This is a natural human instinct to trade, but what's happened over the last 50 years is nothing like anyone has ever seen before in history. And so, there's a lot to it. There's a massive amount of complexity, a massive amount of, things that can go wrong, bottlenecks that are taking place behind the curtain that we need to appreciate and take note of.
Well, Jeff, I certainly don't think about the electricity powering my house until it's not working. Then I begin to become curious, and especially if it doesn't turn on for an extended period of time. A little bit of downturn, no problem, but an extended one is when we start raising questions: is why the
when
electricity
your ice cream starts to melt, is it?
That's right. That's right. And
Or
so
the air conditioner doesn't turn on.
and so I think what we are now at that point. That's why individuals such as Donald Trump in the United States and around the world, in Europe and now increasingly in South America, are coming to the fore, if I could stretch my analogy, is because that electricity has been off for a long time and the people in charge of it haven't been able to turn it on, and the complexity, something is wrong. That's now why we're asking these questions. Why isn't globalization or trade working? Is that right?
I think it's partly right. Your analogy, I think it works. 15 years ago, back in South Florida when I lived there, we went through 3 hurricanes actually in 2 years. And you go through a hurricane event, you expect the power to go off, and you think that's a natural part of the position. But when it stays off for a week and then it goes into 8 days, 9 days, 10 days, you start asking questions. Why haven't they got the power back on? And it's natural to start asking those kinds of questions. And the kinds of questions that you've never thought about before. What is it that's keeping FPL from repairing my particular neighborhood's power lines? And so, it's the absence of economic growth in this context that has led a lot of people to start wondering what's going on here. And I think a lot of people may be understating the nature of populism is the fact that economists and central bankers, government officials have all said that, well, no, the power is back on. We've got to recover. We restored everything. And a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? The economy doesn't seem to be the operating, especially the global economy, doesn't seem to be operating today in the same way it did 10 years ago or 15 years ago, whatever it might be in whatever place. And so there's an even greater disconnect in the fact that most people, or a lot of people, a significant proportion of whatever population, understands that economic recovery isn't happening, yet at the same time they're being told that it is. And that, of course, would lead people to naturally wonder what's going on. And if central bankers aren't going to tell me that what I see on the ground, then I'm going to start turning increasingly to more radical solutions or more radical ideas where at least some people might offer something that sounds a little bit closer to my personal perception of what's going on.
I think that's an interesting perspective, and one we will explore on the other side of our break, because we are unfortunately needing to take a quick break here. So join us again in 60 seconds as we continue our conversation on globalization with Jeffrey Snyder.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands and sponsored by One Trade X.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense and our conversation with Jeffrey Snyder on the subject of globalization. Jeffrey, before the break, you touched on the somewhat emotive subject that although the statistics, as one reads them, and as an economist you read the statistics, and they show economic growth in the US and in many continental European countries in the UK being healthy. The aggregate demand and the aggregate level of output that's being produced today is greater than it was before the financial crisis. The wealth in the economy on aggregate is greater than it was before. Many variables, if not all variables, are pointing towards the economies being healthy and productive. And yet that's not what the general public thinks. There's this undercurrent of popular discontent. Help us understand why that exists and what the causes of that are.
Well, I think there's a lot of short-termism when we talk about economic statistics. GDP in the U.S. last quarter was more than 4%. Hooray! That's great. That sounds terrific, but economic growth is not 1/4 of GDP every 4 years. In fact, the last time we had 4% GDP in the U.S. was in 2014. So that's not economic growth. Those are just positive numbers. And I think we need to understand is that we live in a nonlinear world. Time and compounding are, as Einstein said, the most powerful forces in the universe. And so, the fact that GDP might be growing a little bit, a few percent here and there, is actually contraction in a nonlinear sense. We're falling further and further behind the prior trend. No, by the way, we've never made up for the contraction in 2008, 2009 because it was so large. So we actually have two problems compounded into a single one, which is that the economy never recovered from 2008, 2009. And oh, by the way, over the last 9 years, it's grown even slower than it had before. And so I think that's the perception out there. People realize that the statistics are positive, but on the ground in their everyday lives, they understand in the nonlinear sense, each economy has fallen further and further behind. There are more and more people out of work than there are in work. You know, the U.S. Unemployment rate is a perfect example. If you don't include all the people in the labor force, then yeah, the unemployment rate can be low, but it doesn't count the actual economic potential, which should be evident if everything was actually working the way it's supposed to work.
Jeffrey, my co-host Simon here is contorting his face, and he's trying to understand the non-linear, how we're falling behind in a non-linear sense. I think a powerful example would be to go back to when the last time globalization stopped in the Great Depression, and I know you recently wrote up an essay regarding the fact that the United States is now, or about to be, trailing the cumulative growth rates during that Great Depression. I think that'll be a powerful example for Simon and our audience.
Yeah, if you plot GDP from the 1930s against GDP starting in 2007, unless U.S. output grows by more than 3.8% this year for the whole year, we'll actually be behind the 1930s. And again, it's a lack of growth. It's the fact that just GDP is positive does not denote growth. Growth is a sustainable output that takes place over a long period of time without being interrupted. That's economic growth. It's not the occasional good quarter of GDP here and there. What I mean by linear terms and nonlinear terms, if you're growing at 4% per year every year, and you're compared to growing maybe today at 2% per year every year, the difference is enormous, and it doesn't sound like a lot. In fact, even just 1% difference between 4% and 3%, for example, is a huge amount, especially over time. And again, we're not talking about 1 or 2 quarters here, or even 1 or 2 years. We're talking about 11 years now. So the difference in compounding in economic growth in terms of lost opportunity over 11 years is enormous. Even though GDP is positive, even though economic statistics, industrial production, whatever it might be, they're mostly positive, the fact is it's low grade. There is less growth in the last 11 years than there has been before the crisis. And oh, by the way, we still haven't recovered from the crisis either. And so in nonlinear terms, even though the statistics are mostly positive, the economy in actual fact is falling further and further behind. But we don't see it because, how do you measure opportunity cost? How do you measure lost opportunity? It's almost like proving a counterfactual.
Well, let me
The thing is,
let me sort of dig into that, if I may, because you're saying that we have fallen behind the potential growth rate that we were experiencing. So is it that we actually should be going, there's something faulty in the economy that's stopping us getting to that potential growth rate? Or is it that our expectations need to shift and be more realistic about what the realistic potential growth rate is?
No, I think there's a pretty clear impediment to getting back to economic potential. But that's exactly it. What we're talking about is economic potential. And if the Great Recession had been an actual recession, and something like national income or even GDP would be $4 or $5 trillion more today if the economy had grown at the same trend rate as before 2007. So we're something like $4 or $5 trillion behind in 2018, even though GDP has been positive for however many quarters in a row, however low the unemployment rate goes. We are still further and further behind, and that gap continues to grow each and every quarter, each and every year, because we never kick into a high gear, which is what recovery is supposed to be. So we're missing out on recovery, and in nonlinear terms, we keep falling further and further behind.
And that 4 to 5 trillion, I believe you're referencing, is just the United States. That doesn't take into account Europe, South America, China, Japan. And if I could introduce yet another analogy, the pie is no longer growing, and that's why we see these disagreements, these trade disagreements, as people are now fighting over the slices of the pie. as before, there was cooperation because they knew the overall economic pie was growing. Now everyone's fighting for their slice. And I think that's what we saw the last time globalization stopped in the 1930s. I think there's a lot of analogies to be made there.
Well, yeah, that's exactly. I mean, it's human nature, right? When things are generally good, we tend to be able to cooperate, and different disagreements that are natural that come about just in the natural course of business are easily set aside if everybody agrees that things are very well and we can expect that the future is going to be brighter. When things aren't doing well, when the economy isn't growing, we tend to become more protective. And I think that's what we've seen in the last few years, especially since 2016 on that last downturn. Lots of very large proportions of populations all over the world have started to become more protective of their own sense of what they're supposed to gain, and increasingly cooperation is breaking down because we've gotten to a situation where, again, in a nonlinear world, people are it's not just the United States, it's Europe, it's pretty much the entire global economy has fallen off track, and therefore I'm going to get what's mine, and I don't really care anymore about what you get.
Is there an easy fix to this problem?
I think there's an easy answer. Again, we get back to the monetary system, the breakdown in the grease behind the wheels, or what's behind the curtain in the shadow money system. How to fix it, however, is incredibly difficult and complex, and it has made for an intractable problem that, despite the fact that a lot of nations around the world would love to get out of this monetary system and do something different, the fact that it still remains today, 11 years later, the fact that it broke down on August 9, 2007 and has never been recovered from it, and yet we're still dealing with the same monetary system in place, tells us the fact that it's not something that we can just easily set aside and go into something different. It's an incredibly difficult and incredibly complex challenge to, first of all, decide what it is that's wrong and convince everybody outside that this is the problem, and then to go about designing and crafting a solution to it. It's a very big problem to have.
One of the things I hear you say is that we have a monetary system that broke down in 2008 or thereabouts, and that the opportunity cost that we've lost since then hasn't brought us up to where we would have been. But what I'm struggling with, perhaps, is that it was that monetary system that got us to 2007. So to what extent are you extrapolating something that was itself unsustainable and then arguing now, well, we're not where we could have been, but actually we could never have got there because where we were going on that path was straight over a cliff because the path was unsustainable?
Well, I would argue that globalization, is outside of the monetary characteristics of the Eurodollar system, globalization itself could have happened under a more solid monetary system. So it's not, I think that's a counterfactual that's difficult to argue one way or the other. But I think the growth that we had seen up to 2007 would have been achievable under a more sustainable monetary background. And so I don't think it's a false choice between, 2007, the monetary system blew up, and now we're back to a lower plane of growth that is much closer to the potential or natural truth, however you want to characterize it. I think that all of the ingredients for globalization were there, but they were carried out under an inherently awful system that made it so that it could not go beyond a certain point, and therefore it was unsustainable and unstable to begin with. And so this is a different version of globalization, or I would at least argue that it is, under the monetary system that we had and still have, than what it could have been if it had been put together with a little more care and thought. So I think that 2007 growth, I don't think that was an artificial peak, and that we're now back at a lower, more realistic plane of economic growth. Just looking at the output in the efficiency statistics throughout the world, there is unused labor, there is unused capacity all over the world that could be used for economic growth if something would allow it to be unleashed. And I think Emil's analogy of electricity is a pretty good one. If somebody would turn the lights back on, I think you would see the economy start to grow like it did before. And
so
unfortunately,
electric cattle prods is what I'm hearing.
Well, that's what it may take. We may be cattle prodded into people getting together and trying to make the system go around. But that's the worry, is what is that cattle prod going to be, if I'm stretching the analogy? Because, I keep bringing back the 1930s. It's crisis that forces nations to all work from the same hymn sheet. Jeff, you've said several times, we only have a couple minutes left. You've said that there's something out there, if there's someone out there that could make it work. I'm posing you an impossible question with no time to answer it, but basically, what is that something, what is that someone that could help make the system go again?
Well, the first problem we have, the first step we have to get is to have monetary officials around the world recognize and understand the monetary system as it actually is. And so it's an ideological problem because economics, especially in the orthodox version of it, doesn't recognize this monetary system at all. And therefore, according to central bankers, it can't therefore be broken, which is why they keep talking about recovery and only recovery. And so, the first thing we need to do is to get central bankers off of this idea that there's nothing wrong with the monetary system. And once we do that, then we could start to piece together some kind of alternative that hopefully takes some of the best characteristics of some past examples of global monetary systems without the inherent flaws in the current one.
Jeff, it's been an incredible conversation with you. These are complex subjects. Clearly, your title of global or head of global research at Alhambra Research is well earned. These are not easy to comprehend subjects, but ones which are vital that more people know more about. With that as a segue, it goes without saying that listeners should obviously be thinking about how they can learn more about this subject. And obviously the best way to do that is to attend the CFA Society Cayman Islands Annual Investment Forum, which takes place in 1 week's time at the Ritz-Carlton. The 6th Annual Cayman Investment Forum, Can Globalization Survive? The 11th of October, from around about 11:30. More information is on our website, which is caymaninvestmentforum.com. And all Money Sense listeners, because of your kind listenership, we have a special 10% discount code for you, which is MoneySense10. When you go through the registration process, type that in, all caps, no spaces, the number 10, and you'll get yourself a 10% discount. As a final note, therefore, before we leave, just want to thank all of our listeners and remind you that today's show can be heard as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage you, if you have a question, to email us at moneysense@candw.ky or tweet us at MoneySenseRadio. We will engage in conversation with you on both of those forums. With that, thank you once again, goodbye, and please do tune into Money Sense in 2 weeks' time.
Sense is brought to you with the support of OneTradeX. OneTradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.